The calloused hands at the Dusty Spur saloon can't help but laugh at their new lawman, this bookish sheriff with his wire-rimmed spectacles and quiet ways. They mock his refined manners, his scholarly speech, completely blind to the fact that those same gentle hands can orchestrate death's dance with 6 guns faster than a rattler's strike. They're about to learn that wisdom and deadliness often come in the same package, and that sometimes the most lethal predator is the one that doesn't bare its fangs until it's too late. Before we dive deeper into this tale of misjudgment and lightning-fast justice, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you're ready to witness how a scholar became the deadliest gun in the West, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. The morning sun climbed over the jagged peaks of the Sawblade Mountains, painting redemption's edge in harsh light and deep shadow. The town had sprung up like a desert flower after a storm when gold was discovered in Dead Man's Canyon 3 years ago. Now, what had once been a quiet waystation boasted 3 saloons, 2 hotels, and more trouble than any 10 normal towns. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood's morning rounds took him past weather-worn buildings where newcomers' paint tried to hide old sins. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the sunlight as he paused to help Mrs. Chen unload supplies for her laundry, his movements carrying a grace that seemed better suited to university halls than frontier streets. The twin Colt revolvers at his hips looked almost apologetic, like accessories added as an afterthought to complete his lawman's costume. Inside the Dusty Spur saloon, Buck the Butcher McGraw watched through the grimy window, nursing his morning whiskey. "Look at him," he sneered to his companion, a newly arrived gunslinger named Clay Winters. "Helping with the laundry like some proper gentleman, bet those guns ain't even loaded, probably fills them with poetry instead of bullets." The saloon erupted in laughter, but old Jack Turner, watching from his usual spot by the pot-bellied stove, merely smiled into his coffee. He'd been the one to recommend Blackwood for the job, though few knew why. Fewer still knew about the hours spent in hidden box canyons, perfecting shots that most men would consider impossible, or the ancient techniques Jack had passed down from his own teacher. "You weren't here last month," Emma Sullivan, the saloon's owner, said quietly as she wiped down the bar. Her eyes, sharp as desert hawks, never left the scene outside. "When those Miller boys decided to test our scholarly sheriff, 3 shots faster than a man could blink, left both standing, but their guns—" She shook her head, still amazed at the memory. "Never seen anything like it." Doc Eleanor Hayes stepped out onto her clinic's porch, her medical bag in hand. The town's only female doctor had earned respect the hard way. Much like the sheriff, she now watched with knowing eyes. She'd seen those gentle hands perform miracles, not just with guns but helping her set bones, stitch wounds, even deliver babies. "The quiet ones," she'd often say. "They're the ones you ought to watch closest." Deputy Mason Hawkins, barely 20 and still trying to grow a proper mustache, rushed up to Blackwood with the morning telegrams. The young man had been transformed under Blackwood's tutelage, learning that true law enforcement required more than just a quick draw and a stern look. "Sheriff," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of urgency that made several heads turn. "Word from Tucson. The Scorpion Gang broke out of Yuma 2 days ago. Burned Half Moon Station to the ground yesterday. They're headed this way." The name sent a ripple through the morning crowd. Vicente, the Sting. Ramirez and his Scorpions had terrorized 3 territories before Blackwood's testimony put them away 6 months ago. Their capture had been like something from a dime novel. 3 precise shots that had disarmed both Ramirez brothers without spilling a drop of blood. Some called it luck. Others whispered about deals with the devil. But a few old-timers had recognized something else, something that reminded them of legends they'd heard around campfires. Blackwood adjusted his spectacles, studying the telegram with the same careful attention he gave to his beloved books. His eyes, sharp behind those scholarly lenses, scanned the street with methodical precision. He noted Buck McGraw's hand resting too close to his gun, saw Clay Winters studying his movements with professional interest, caught the subtle gathering of hard-eyed men around the saloon's entrance. "How many escaped?" he asked quietly, his educated accent making the words sound almost poetic. "All 8, Mason replied, nervously checking his own weapon. "Vicente, his brother Ramon, the Carson twins, all of them. Marshall's wire says they're leaving a trail of blood from Yuma to here. 4 dead in Half Moon, including the sheriff. He hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd. They nailed his badge to his chest with his own letter opener. Old Jack Turner hobbled over, his wooden leg thumping against the boardwalk. The former lawman's weathered face carried the weight of urgent news. "Thomas," he said softly, using the sheriff's first name as few dared to do. "Just got word from my contact in Bitter Creek. Ramirez has been recruiting. 20 riders spotted heading north from the border yesterday. Mean ones, professionals." The scholarly sheriff nodded, absently touching the spine of the small book visible in his vest pocket, a collection of ancient Chinese military strategies that never left his side. "The art of war," he'd once told Mason. "Sun Tzu teaches us that appearing weak when you are strong can be your greatest advantage." Inside the Dusty Spur, Buck McGraw's laughter grew louder, fueled by whiskey and bravado. 8 killers and 20 guns coming to town," he announced to the crowded room. "Reckon our bookworm sheriff might want to start writing his obituary in that fancy hand of his." But Doc Hayes, still watching from her porch, saw what others missed. The subtle shift in Blackwood's stance, the way those gentle hands hung loose and ready at his sides, the calculating look behind those wire-rimmed spectacles. She'd seen that look before, right before those same scholarly hands had moved faster than sight itself. The storm was coming to redemption's edge. Soon, everyone would learn what a few already knew, that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the thunder that announces itself with a roar, but the lightning that strikes in silence. Inside the jail, Deputy Mason organized the morning's paperwork while Sheriff Blackwood methodically cleaned his Colts. The weapons gleamed in the early light streaming through barred windows, their well-worn grips and unadorned barrels speaking of utility rather than show. No fancy silver engraving, no mother-of-pearl handles, just precise instruments maintained with scientific care. "Never understood why you clean them like that," Mason commented, watching his mentor's practiced movements. "Most men I know just run a cloth through the barrel and call it done." Blackwood's hands moved with surgical precision as he reassembled the first revolver. "In my studies at Harvard, I learned that precision requires perfect conditions. A surgeon doesn't operate with dirty instruments. A scientist doesn't peer through a smudged microscope." He held the gun up to the light, checking the alignment. "And a man who stakes his life on accuracy can't afford imperfect tools." The door burst open as Buck McGraw strutted in, the smell of whiskey preceding him. 2 of his cronies flanked him, Clay Winters and a scarred mountain of a man known only as Bear. "Well, ain't this precious?" Buck sneered, swaying slightly. "Our scholar sheriff playing with his toys. Heard about the Scorpions coming. Figured you might want some real men helping to protect the town." Blackwood continued his maintenance without looking up. "Mr. McGraw, I believe we've discussed the appropriate hours for conducting business. Perhaps you could return when you're less refreshed?" Bear stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the desk. "Listen, Bookworm. Buck's offering to help, and you'd be smart to take it. Ramirez and his boys ain't going to be impressed by your fancy words and clean guns." Old Jack Turner chose that moment to enter, his wooden leg announcing his arrival like a judge's gavel. "Thomas," he called out, ignoring the 3 intruders. "Got more news you need to hear." His eyes, sharp despite his years, took in the scene. "Though perhaps we should discuss it in private." Buck's hand dropped to his gun. "Ain't nothing private about town business, old man. We got a right to—" "Mr. McGraw." Blackwood's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade, soft but carrying an edge that made everyone freeze. He finally looked up from his guns, those scholarly eyes somehow harder than before. "I believe you're familiar with Town Ordinance Number 7? The one concerning the wearing of firearms while under the influence of spirits?" The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Buck's face reddened, his hand still hovering near his holster. But something in the sheriff's steady gaze made him hesitate. "Come on, Buck," Clay muttered, tugging at his friend's arm. "Ain't worth it. Not yet." The 3 men backed out, but Buck paused at the door. "When Ramirez comes," he growled, "ain't gonna be no law books or clean guns saving you. Real justice comes from iron and blood. and blood. After they left, Jack settled into a chair with a grunt. Getting worse, Thomas. My contact in Bitter Creek sent another wire. Ramirez has been spreading gold around, buying information. He knows about Emma Sullivan helping you during the arrest, about Doc Hayes treating his brother's wound. He's making lists. Blackwood nodded, his hands automatically returning to their maintenance routine. And our other preparations? Martha Gray's converting the old mine office into a shelter, stocking it with supplies. Doc Hayes is setting up a second clinic in the basement of the church. Emma's keeping count of every stranger coming through her doors. The old lawman leaned forward. But that ain't all. Remember Billy Tate? The gunsmith from Tucson? Found him dead this morning out by Copper Creek. Professional job, single shot, long range. Someone's cutting off our options, making sure we can't get supplies or help. Mason's young face showed his worry. Should we send for the marshal? Territory rangers, maybe? 3 days minimum for help to arrive, Blackwood replied, finally holstering his cleaned weapons. By then it'll be over one way or another. Outside, the town continued its nervous morning routine. Mrs. Chen's laundry fluttered like surrender flags in the hot breeze. The schoolhouse stood empty, Martha Gray having sent the children home after news of the scorpion spread. Doc Hayes worked efficiently in her clinic, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. Emma Sullivan watched from her saloon as more strangers rode in, each one carrying the look of a predator scanning for weakness. She'd seen their kind before, back in New Orleans. Men who smiled while planning murder, who bought drinks with one hand while holding a knife in the other. 17 new faces since sunrise, she reported when Blackwood stopped by. Most heading straight for Buck's table. They're trying to be subtle about it, but they're positioning themselves around town like chess pieces. The sheriff adjusted his spectacles, those quick eyes noting each new arrival's location. And our special guests? Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. Basement room, just like you asked. 4 men, all former rangers. They understand what you need them to do. Jack made everything clear. When it starts, they'll know their parts. A commotion drew their attention to the street. 2 of the newcomers had cornered young Tommy Chen, Mrs. Chen's 12-year-old son, accusing him of deliberately splashing water on their boots. The boys' frightened protests carried clearly in the tense air. Before anyone could blink, Blackwood stood between them, those scholarly hands hanging loose at his sides. Gentlemen, he said quietly, his Harvard accent incongruous in the dusty street. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The taller stranger, a snake-faced man with a Confederate cavalry hat, sized up the bespectacled lawman. Ain't no misunderstanding, friend. Boy needs to learn respect. Ain't your concern, anyhow. Actually, Blackwood replied, the safety of every citizen in Redemption's Edge is very much my concern. Now, young Tommy here is late for his mathematics lesson. I suggest you let him proceed. Snakeface's hand dropped to his gun. Or what, Professor? Gonna read us a book about... What happened next became the first whispered legend of many to come. Later, witnesses would argue about exactly what they saw. Some claimed Blackwood never even moved. Others swore they saw a blur of motion, too fast to follow. All anyone knew for certain was that suddenly Snakeface's gun belt was in pieces on the ground, his weapon neatly disassembled, and a small throwing knife, that no one had even seen drawn, was pinning his partner's sleeve to the water trough. Mathematics is very important, Blackwood said mildly, adjusting his spectacles, as is proper weapon maintenance. You really should clean your firing mechanisms more regularly. They can become quite fragile when neglected. As Tommy scampered away and the humiliated men gathered their scattered equipment, Buck McGraw watched from the saloon, his face darkening with each whispered retelling of the incident. Tomorrow, he growled to his growing circle of hired guns. Tomorrow, when Ramirez arrives, we'll see what fancy tricks do against real killers. But old Jack Turner, overhearing, simply smiled and patted the ancient book of Chinese military wisdom that Blackwood had given him to read. Supreme excellence, he quoted softly, consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. As afternoon heat shimmered across Redemption's Edge, Doc Eleanor Hayes found Sheriff Blackwood in an unusual place, the town's small library, housed in the back room of Martha Gray's former schoolhouse. The scholarly lawman sat at a worn desk, studying an ancient leather-bound book with the same intensity he brought to tracking outlaws. 3 more wounded brought in from Copper Creek, she announced without preamble. Survivors from a supply wagon said the Scorpions are less than half a day's ride out. She paused, noting the open volumes scattered across the desk. Thomas, this isn't the time for reading. Blackwood looked up, lamplight reflecting off his wire-rimmed spectacles. On the contrary, Doctor, as Sun Tzu teaches us, every battle is won before it's ever fought. His finger traced a line of Chinese characters. The key is understanding not just your opponent's weapons, but their mind. And what does your reading tell you about Ramirez's mind? That he's not just seeking revenge. Blackwood stood, moving to a map of the territory pinned to the wall. Look at his pattern. Half Moon Station, Copper Creek, the dead gunsmith. He's not just leaving a trail of destruction, he's systematically isolating us, cutting off help, supplies, escape routes. This isn't just about killing me anymore, he wants to make an example of the entire town. A commotion from the street interrupted them. Buck McGraw's voice carried clearly through the windows, alcohol-fueled and belligerent. You're all blind, our sheriff sits in here reading while killers ride toward us. Well, some of us ain't gonna wait to die. Doc Hayes moved to the window. A crowd had gathered around Buck and his growing band of hired guns. Clay Winter stood at his right, while Bear's massive frame loomed behind them. New faces filled the edges of the group, hard-eyed men with well-worn gun belts and cold expressions. Man's got a point, someone shouted. Ramirez is bringing an army, and we've got a bookworm for protection. Perhaps, Blackwood said quietly. It's time for a different kind of lesson. He moved toward the door with that same fluid grace that made so many underestimate him. Doc Hayes noticed his hands were empty, the twin Colts still resting in their holsters. Outside, the crowd parted as the sheriff approached. Buck's face twisted into a sneer. Well, look who finally left his library. Come to give us a lecture on proper grammar while we wait to die. Actually, Mr. McGraw, I thought we might discuss practical physics. Blackwood's voice carried clearly in the tense air. Specifically, the mathematics of precision shooting. Buck's laugh was harsh. Ain't no mathematics in gunfighting, Professor. It's about iron and blood, like I told you. A common misconception. Blackwood removed his spectacles, carefully cleaning them with a handkerchief. You see, everything in nature follows mathematical principles. The arc of a bullet, the speed of a draw, even the subtle adjustments needed for wind resistance, all can be calculated with proper understanding. Proper understanding? Buck's hand dropped to his gun. Let's see how your calculations stand up to real steel. What happened next became another chapter in Redemption's Edge's growing legend. Buck's draw was famous in 3 territories, a sidewinder strike that had killed 11 men. But before his gun cleared leather, 3 shots rang out in such rapid succession they sounded like a single crack. Buck stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. His gun belt fell apart, the weapon clattering to the dirt in pieces. Clay Winters found his own gun mysteriously disassembled, while Bear's massive revolver had somehow been stripped of its firing mechanism. Blackwood calmly replaced his spectacles. You see, gentlemen, it's all about precision. The human hand moves in predictable patterns. A gunfighter's draw follows specific arcs. Once you understand the mathematics involved, it's simply a matter of calculating the intersecting points. Old Jack Turner emerged from the crowd, his weathered face split by a knowing grin. Fastest gun in the West ain't about speed, boys. It's about knowing where to shoot before the other man even moves. Doc Hayes watched the gathered men's expressions shift from mockery to disbelief to something approaching fear. But she also noticed what others missed, how Blackwood's demonstration had drawn attention away from the library's back door, where Deputy Mason was quietly leading Martha Gray's schoolchildren to the shelter in the old mine office. Think you're clever, don't you? Buck snarled, still staring at his ruined weapon. Think your fancy tricks make you special? Wait till Ramirez gets here. He ain't going to play target practice with you. He's going to burn this whole town down, starting with anyone who ever helped you. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Blackwood's voice carried a new edge. How much did Ramirez pay you, Buck? Was 30 pieces of silver enough to betray your neighbors? Enough? The crowd's mood shifted again as understanding dawned. Buck's face reddened as hands moved toward weapons. But before violence could erupt, Emma Sullivan's voice cut through the tension. "Riders coming!" From the south. Everyone turned to see a cloud of dust on the horizon. Through his spotting glass, Blackwood counted 7 riders approaching at a steady pace. Not Ramirez's main force. This was something else. "Scout party," Old Jack growled. "Testing our defenses, looking for weak spots." The town seemed to hold its breath as the riders approached. Buck and his men melted away into the saloons and alleyways, while townspeople hurried to get off the streets. Doc Hayes noticed how Blackwood positioned himself carefully, using the afternoon sun to his advantage. The lead rider was a lean Mexican, wearing a silver-studded sombrero, Ramon Ramirez, Vicente's younger brother. His face bore the scar from their last encounter, when Blackwood's precision shot had disarmed him without taking his life. He reined his horse to a stop at the edge of town. "Sheriff," his voice carried clearly in the tense air. "My brother sends his regards. Says to tell you he's coming to finish our discussion about justice." He patted the rifle resting across his saddle. "Says this time he's going to take everything you care about piece by piece until you understand the price of interference." Blackwood stepped forward, those scholarly hands hanging loose at his sides. "Mr. Ramirez, your brother's quarrel is with me. The good people of this town are not involved." Ramon's laugh was as harsh as the desert wind. "That's where you're wrong, Professor. Everyone who helped you, everyone who sheltered you, everyone who showed you kindness, they're all involved now. By sunset tomorrow, Redemption's Edge will be ashes, and everyone will know what happens to those who stand with the bookworm sheriff." The scouts wheeled their horses, kicking up dust as they rode away. But everyone heard Ramon's parting shot. "Hope you've got enough bullets in those pretty guns, Sheriff. My brother's bringing 50 men who ain't impressed by mathematics." In the aftermath, Doc Hayes approached Blackwood, who stood watching the dust cloud recede. "Thomas," she said softly, "I've seen what 50 guns can do to a town. Maybe we should evacuate while there's still time." "Elena," he replied, using her first name as he rarely did. "Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from having more guns, but from having them in exactly the right places." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of lightning before a storm. "Besides, you haven't seen what one gun can do in the hands of someone who understands the precision of both science and violence." As evening shadows crept across Redemption's Edge, Sheriff Blackwood gathered his allies in the back room of Doc Hayes' clinic. Deputy Mason worked on loading spare ammunition, while Old Jack Turner cleaned a collection of rifles laid out on the examination table. Emma Sullivan studied a rough map of the town, marking positions with copper coins from her saloon's till. Ramon's scouts weren't just showing force, Blackwood explained, his scholarly tone at odds with the preparations for violence surrounding him. They were mapping our weaknesses, counting our guns. But more importantly, they were trying to spread fear. "Working too," Mason commented, his young face tight with worry. "Saw 3 families loading wagons out by the livery stable. More talking about leaving before dawn." "Let them go," Doc Hayes said firmly, organizing medical supplies into portable kits. "Better to have fewer civilians to protect when hell breaks loose." Old Jack looked up from his work, his weathered hands never stopping their methodical motion. 50 guns, Thomas. Even with your speed, those are long odds. 50 undisciplined guns fighting for money and revenge," Blackwood corrected, adjusting his spectacles, "against precisely placed shots from defenders who understand the mathematics of position and trajectory." He moved to Emma's map. "Show me what you've observed." The saloon owner's finger traced paths between buildings. "Buck's men are spreading out, taking up positions here, here, and here. They're trying to be subtle, but I counted 23 new faces since noon. Most experienced guns for hire I've ever seen in one place." Which means they'll understand the value of cover and crossfire, Blackwood mused. They'll try to pin us down while Ramirez's main force attacks from multiple directions. A knock at the back door made everyone tense. Martha Gray slipped in, her school teachers dressed dusty from organizing the shelter. The children are settled in the mine office, she reported. Tom Chen and his mother are with them, along with anyone else who can't fight. But Thomas... She hesitated. Buck's men were watching. They know where we've hidden them. Blackwood's hands moved in that practiced way that had become familiar to his allies, checking his guns without seeming to look at them. They were meant to know. Ramirez wants hostages, leverage. He's expecting us to split our forces to protect them. But that's exactly what we'll have to do, Mason protested. We can't leave them undefended. A small smile touched the scholarly sheriff's lips. Sun Tzu teaches us all warfare is based on deception. What appears to be our weakness can become our strength, if properly understood. Old Jack's eyes lit with understanding. The Rangers in Emma's basement. Precisely. While Buck's men watch the mine office thinking they've found our vulnerable point, 4 experienced lawmen will be moving through the tunnels beneath the town, ready to emerge where they're least expected. Doc Hayes shook her head in admiration. You've been planning this since before Ramon's scouts arrived. A surgeon plans her cuts before making the first incision, Blackwood replied. Just as a mathematician solves equations by understanding all variables. He turned to Emma. Are the positions prepared? She nodded. Water barrels placed exactly where you specified. Rifle slots cut in the stable loft. Signals arranged with everyone who's staying to fight. A commotion from the street interrupted their planning. Clay Winters's voice carried clearly through the evening air. Time's up, Sheriff. Boss wants to talk terms. Blackwood moved to the window, those quick eyes taking in the scene. Winters stood in the middle of the street, flanked by Bear and 4 other gunmen. Behind them, Buck McGraw watched from the saloon porch, his face twisted in a satisfied smirk. This is your last chance, Winters called out. Ride out now. Leave your badge. And maybe Ramirez lets the town stand. Stay, and tomorrow, we burn it all. The scholarly sheriff adjusted his spectacles with that same delicate precision he brought to everything. Time to begin our lesson in advanced mathematics, he said softly. Then, louder. Mr. Winters, perhaps we should discuss the inverse relationship between threat and capability. He stepped out onto the street, those gentle hands hanging loose at his sides. The gathering darkness painted long shadows across the dirt, turning the scene into a study in contrast. The refined lawman facing brutal force. To everyone watching, it looked like a scholar walking to his doom. But Doc Hayes, watching from the clinic window, saw what others missed. The subtle shift in Blackwood's stance, the way his fingers moved in tiny calculations, the look behind those wire-rimmed spectacles that meant equations were being solved faster than thought. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Some said it was like watching death itself dance. Others claimed it was too fast to see it all. Clay Winters and his men went for their guns with the confidence of killers who had never met their match. 6 shots rang out as one. When the echo faded, 6 gun belts lay in the dust, their weapons scattered in pieces. Blackwood hadn't moved from his spot, though somehow his spectacles now held a tiny fleck of gun oil on one lens. As I said, he commented mildly, removing his glasses to clean them. There's an inverse relationship between threat and capability. Those who boast loudest often shoot poorest. He looked directly at Buck McGraw. Remember that tomorrow, when your real employer arrives. Sometimes the deadliest force isn't the one that announces itself with thunder. As Blackwood turned to go, Buck's rage-filled voice followed him. You think you're so clever with your fancy words and tricks? Tomorrow you'll learn what real killing looks like. Ramirez is going to... Mr. McGraw, Blackwood interrupted without looking back. I suggest you spend the night considering one final mathematical principle. The difference between 50 men shooting to kill and 1 man shooting to end fights without death. By tomorrow evening, we'll all understand which number carries more weight. Dawn painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, as Redemption's Edge awakened to what many feared would be its last day. Sheriff Blackwood stood on his office porch watching the sun climb over the Sawblade Mountains. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the light as he studied a piece of paper covered in precise mathematical calculations. "More equations?" Deputy Mason asked, bringing coffee that Emma Sullivan had brewed strong enough to dissolve a spoon. "Trajectory calculations," Blackwood replied, making a final notation. "Wind speed, elevation, barrel wear. Every variable matters when precision means the difference between disarming and killing." "Killing might be easier today," Old Jack commented, stumping up with his wooden leg. "Got word from my contact in the hills. Ramirez's main force camped at Thunder Canyon last night. 53 riders, all armed to the teeth. They'll be here by noon." Inside the jail, Clay Winters sat in a cell, his face still showing disbelief from the previous evening's demonstration. "You don't understand what's coming, Professor," he called out as Blackwood entered. "I've ridden with Ramirez, seen what he does to towns that resist. Man's got a real talent for making examples." "Interesting choice of words, Mr. Winters." Blackwood began his morning ritual of weapon maintenance, those scholarly hands moving with surgical precision. Talent. From the Greek talenton, originally a unit of measurement, later coming to mean one's natural aptitude or skill. The question isn't about talent, though. It's about how we choose to use it. A commotion outside drew their attention. Buck McGraw stood in the street, his face flushed with early morning whiskey and anticipation. "Last chance, bookworm. Ramirez will be here soon. Ride out now. Maybe some of these good folks live to see sunset." Doc Hayes appeared at Blackwood's side, her medical bag clutched tight. "Thomas, Martha sent word. Buck's men have been watching the mine office all night. They know about the children." "Good." At her surprised look, he explained. "Sometimes the most effective defense comes from letting your enemy think they've discovered your weakness. They'll focus their forces there, exactly where we want them." The Rangers in the tunnels, she realized, along with something else they don't expect. He touched the book of Chinese military wisdom in his vest pocket. What is of supreme importance in war is to attack the enemy's strategy. Through his spotting glass, Blackwood counted more hired guns taking positions around town. They tried to be subtle about it, but to his mathematically trained eye, their movements formed clear patterns, like equations waiting to be solved. Emma Sullivan hurried up, her usual calm shaken. "Just lost my back door guard. Someone shot him with a buffalo rifle from the hills. They're picking off anyone standing watch." "They're isolating us," Old Jack growled. "Cutting off escape routes, eliminating defenders one by one." Blackwood nodded. "Classic siege tactics, but they've made a fundamental miscalculation. They think they're hunting a scholar who happens to wear a badge. They don't realize they're facing a mathematician who understands the geometry of violence." A rider appeared at the edge of town, another of Ramirez's scouts. He carried a white flag in one hand and a familiar object in the other. "That's Bill Chen's hat," Doc Hayes whispered, "from the water tower guard post." The scout rode to the center of the street. "Found your watchman, Sheriff. Boss says there's plenty more hats to collect. Gives you one more hour to clear out or we start sending back more than just hats." Blackwood's response was to step into the street, those gentle hands hanging loose at his sides. The morning sun caught his spectacles, momentarily hiding his eyes. "Tell Mr. Ramirez that perhaps we should discuss the ethics of threatening civilians. I have several philosophical treatises on the subject that—" The scout's patience snapped. His rifle came up with practiced speed, the white flag dropping forgotten in the dust. But Blackwood's hands moved like liquid lightning. 2 shots rang out as one. The scout's rifle fell apart, its firing mechanism neatly removed. His gun belt followed, cut clean through by the second bullet. He sat his horse in shocked silence, staring at his disassembled weapons. "As I was saying," Blackwood continued mildly, "the ethics of civilian targeting are quite complex. But perhaps we could begin with a simpler lesson, the mathematics of precise shot placement. Would you like me to demonstrate further?" The scout wheeled his horse and galloped away, but his parting words carried clearly. "You're dead, Professor. You and everyone who stands with you." "Well," Old Jack commented dryly, Reckon that sets the tone for the day. Blackwood calmly reloaded his Colts. Indeed, though they still haven't grasped the fundamental principle that precision matched with purpose will always overcome mere numbers. A sound like distant thunder rolled across the valley, but the cloudless sky told a different story. Hoofbeats, Mason said, his young face pale but determined. Lots of them. Ramirez, Buck called out gleefully from his position by the saloon. Time to see what your books and calculations are worth against real killers, But Doc Hayes, watching Blackwood adjust his spectacles with that same meticulous care he brought to everything, saw something that made her heart skip. There was a look in his eyes that she'd seen before, the same look he'd had that day 3 months ago, when he'd disarmed 2 gunmen so fast that time itself seemed to stop. The storm was coming to redemption's edge, but as the thunder of approaching hooves grew louder, she realized that perhaps the real storm had been here all along, quietly maintaining order, solving equations of trajectory and justice with hands that moved faster than human eyes could follow. Time for the final lesson, Blackwood said softly, those scholarly hands hanging ready at his sides. Let's show them what happens when lightning strikes before thunder arrives. The thunder of hoofbeats grew closer as dust clouds rose on the horizon. Vicente Ramirez and his scorpion gang emerged from the morning haze like demons from a desert mirage. At their head rode Ramirez himself, his black duster decorated with silver scorpions, his face bearing the same cold calculation that had earned him his reputation across 3 territories. Positions, Blackwood called out quietly. Throughout the town, defenders moved with practiced precision to their assigned spots. In the stable loft, old Jack settled behind a rifle, his wooden leg braced against a hay bale. Doc Hayes ducked into her clinic where her medical supplies were arranged with the same attention to detail that the sheriff brought to his calculations. Deputy Mason took his place behind a water barrel, his young hands steady on his weapon. Just like you taught me, he muttered. Read the geometry of the situation. See the shots before taking them. Emma Sullivan watched from her saloon window as Buck McGraw and his hired guns emerged from various hiding spots, taking up positions that effectively surrounded the town's defenders. The trap was obvious. They would catch Blackwood's people in a crossfire when Ramirez attacked. But the scholarly sheriff showed no concern as he stood in the middle of the street, those wire-rimmed spectacles catching the morning sun. His hands hung loose at his sides, those same gentle hands that had disassembled so many weapons without taking a single life. Ramirez reined his horse to a stop at the edge of town, his gang spreading out behind him in a practiced formation. Professor, he called out, his voice carrying the edge of a snake's hiss. Still playing at being a lawman, I see. Did you really think those clever tricks with guns would be enough? Mr. Ramirez, Blackwood replied calmly, as if addressing a student who'd failed to grasp a simple equation. I see you still haven't learned the fundamental difference between quantity and quality. Quality? Ramirez laughed harshly. I've got 50 killers who say different. Buck, show our scholarly friend what real quality looks like. Buck McGraw's voice rang out from behind. Now, boys! Light 'em up! What happened next would be told and retold in every saloon from Texas to California. Buck's men opened fire from their hiding spots, expecting to catch the town's defenders in a deadly crossfire. But Blackwood was already moving, his hands becoming a blur of precise motion. 6 shots rang out in rapid succession, so fast they seemed to merge into a single sound. 6 of Buck's men found their weapons mysteriously disassembled, the pieces falling to the dust with mechanical precision. Before they could recover, 6 more shots followed, each one finding its mark with surgical accuracy. Impossible, Buck screamed, raising his own gun. Nobody's that fast. Not speed, Mr. McGraw, Blackwood corrected, his glasses glinting as he reloaded with fluid grace. Precision, the mathematics of trajectory, calculated to disarm rather than destroy. Ramirez's cold laugh cut through the chaos. Pretty tricks, Professor? But I brought more than just guns this time. He raised his hand, and mounted riders appeared on the ridges surrounding town, each carrying a torch. How's your mathematics against fire? Ah, Blackwood replied, adjusting his spectacles. I was wondering when you'd play that card. Perhaps we should discuss the properties of water displacement and strategic barrel placement. On cue, the rangers hidden in the tunnels emerged behind Ramirez's torchbearers. The crack of their rifles was punctuated by the sound of dropping torches and surprised shouts. At the same time, Emma Sullivan's hidden defenders revealed themselves on the rooftops, their guns trained on Ramirez's main force. You see, Blackwood continued in his scholarly tone, when you understand the geometry of conflict, positioning becomes more important than numbers. Your men are now caught in what military texts call a tactical crossfire. Ramirez's face darkened with rage. Kill them all, he roared, drawing his famous silver-plated revolvers. Burn everything. Everything. But Blackwood's hands had already moved. 2 shots split the air and Ramirez's prized guns fell to pieces. 2 more shots followed before anyone could blink, disarming his closest lieutenants with mechanical precision. 22, old Jack called out from his position. 22 guns disabled, Thomas. Might be a new record. Buck, seeing his plans unraveling, made one final desperate play. The mine office, he shouted to his remaining men. The children. Show them we mean business. Ah, yes, Blackwood said mildly, his hands still moving with that deadly grace. I was hoping you'd try that. You see, while you were watching the mine office, you forgot one of Sun Tzu's most important principles. All warfare is based on deception. The ground seemed to explode as the hidden rangers burst from tunnel entrances throughout the town, catching Buck's men in a carefully planned trap. More guns fell to pieces under Blackwood's precisely calculated shots, each bullet finding its mark with mathematical certainty. This isn't possible, Ramirez snarled, watching his carefully planned attack dissolve into chaos. You're just a bookworm with a badge, a professor playing at being a lawman. A common misconception, Blackwood replied, those gentle hands still moving with liquid accuracy. I'm a mathematician who understands that every bullet follows the laws of physics. Every conflict adheres to geometric principles, and every fight can be resolved with proper calculation. As the morning sun climbed higher over redemption's edge, the legend of the scholarly sheriff who brought mathematics to gunfighting was being written in disabled weapons and amazed witnesses. But the final chapter was yet to come, and Vicente Ramirez wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily, especially not from a bookworm with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that moved like lightning given purpose. Vicente Ramirez surveyed the chaos around him, his carefully planned attack unraveling under the precise geometry of Blackwood's defense. 30 guns lay disabled in the dust, their pieces scattered like a complex puzzle that no one could reassemble. But the notorious outlaw's face showed no fear, only a cold calculation that had made him feared across the territories. You think you're clever, Professor? He snarled, dismounting with fluid grace. Think your mathematics and trick shots make you special. But I've got something that doesn't need guns. He pulled a stick of dynamite from his saddlebag, already lit. Let's see you calculate your way out of this. The explosive arced through the morning air, heading straight for Doc Hayes's clinic where the wounded were being treated. But Blackwood's hands moved with that same precise speed that had become legend. 2 shots rang out as one, the first severing the fuse in mid-flight, the second knocking the stick harmlessly into a water trough. Basic ballistics, Mr. Ramirez, Blackwood commented mildly, adjusting his spectacles. The parabolic arc of a thrown object is quite predictable when you understand the mathematics involved. The children, Buck McGraw's voice carried from near the mine office. Do it now. A explosion rocked the ground but not where Buck had expected. The hidden rangers burst from the real shelter beneath Emma's saloon, catching the would-be hostage-takers in a carefully planned crossfire. More guns fell to pieces under Blackwood's precisely calculated shots. 42, old Jack called out from his position. 42 guns disabled without a drop of blood spilled. Ain't never seen anything like it. Ramirez's face twisted with rage. You want blood, Professor? I'll show you blood. He reached into his duster, pulling out a peculiar weapon, a custom-made gun with 3 barrels. This was meant for a special occasion. Guess this qualifies. Interesting design, Blackwood observed. Those quick eyes analyzing the weapon's geometry. Triple-barrel percussion cap, custom firing mechanism. The mathematics of its trajectory must be quite complex. Let's test your calculations. Ramirez raised the weapon with snake-like speed. What happened next became the crowning legend of Redemption's Edge. Ramirez fired all 3 barrels at once, the sound like thunder compressed into a single moment. But Blackwood's hands moved with impossible precision, his own shots threading through the chaos with mathematical certainty. When the echo faded, Ramirez's prized weapon lay in pieces at his feet, each barrel neatly separated, the firing mechanism disassembled with surgical accuracy. 3 bullets had found 3 precise points, solving an equation of physics and justice in the blink of an eye. Impossible, Ramirez whispered, staring at his destroyed weapon. Nobody's that fast, nobody's that accurate. Not speed, Mr. Ramirez, Blackwood corrected, calmly reloading. Precision, understanding that every bullet follows laws of physics, every trajectory can be calculated, every conflict reduced to its mathematical components. But Vicente Ramirez hadn't become a legend by giving up easily. With a movement born of desperate cunning, he grabbed one of his fallen men's backup guns, spinning to take aim at the schoolhouse where Martha Gray stood watching from a window. Calculate this, Professor. Blackwood's hands moved one final time, becoming a blur that seemed to bend the laws of time itself. 5 shots rang out in such rapid succession they sounded like a single note. When clarity returned, Ramirez stood frozen, surrounded by the pieces of 5 different weapons he'd tried to use in sequence. 47, old Jack announced with quiet awe. 47 guns disabled without taking a single life. That's got to be some kind of record. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader's weapons reduced to scattered metal, began throwing down their guns. Buck McGraw and his hired killers followed suit, their bravado replaced by something approaching religious fear. How? Ramirez demanded, his legendary composure finally cracking. How can anyone shoot like that? Blackwood carefully cleaned his spectacles with a handkerchief. When I was at Harvard, studying advanced mathematics, my professor said that every problem, no matter how complex, could be solved through proper calculation. Later, when I learned the art of the gun, I realized the same principle applied. Every shot is an equation waiting to be solved. Doc Hayes emerged from her clinic, surveying the scattered pieces of 47 guns with amazement. Not a single death, she marveled. Not one killing shot fired. Violence, Blackwood replied quietly, is what happens when we fail to find more precise solutions. He turned to Ramirez, who stood amidst the wreckage of his reputation. Now, shall we discuss the ethics of threatening innocent towns, or would you prefer another lesson in applied mathematics? As the morning sun climbed higher over Redemption's Edge, the legend of the scholarly sheriff was already spreading. Not just a tale of the fastest gun in the West, but of a man who brought mathematics to gunfighting, who proved that precision could overcome brute force, and who showed that the most powerful weapon wasn't speed or strength, but the combination of knowledge and mercy. In the days following what became known as the Great Calculation, Redemption's Edge underwent a transformation. The scattered pieces of 47 disabled guns had been gathered and displayed in Emma Sullivan's saloon, a mathematical proof written in steel and lead that precision could overcome brute force. Sheriff Blackwood sat at his desk, wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting lamplight as he completed his report for the territorial marshal. His precise handwriting filled pages with detailed calculations of trajectories, wind speeds, and the exact force needed to disassemble a weapon without harming its wielder. Got another batch of visitors, Deputy Mason announced, entering with fresh coffee. 3 more lawmen from up north wanting to learn your methods, making quite a name for yourself, Thomas. The methods aren't mine, Blackwood replied, carefully cleaning his spectacles. They belong to anyone willing to understand that justice doesn't require killing, only precise application of force supported by careful calculation. Doc Hayes entered, carrying her medical bag. Well, your precise applications have certainly changed things. First week in months, I haven't had to treat a single gunshot wound, though I did have to bandage Vicente Ramirez's pride. She smiled. He's still trying to understand how you split his triple-barrel gun into exactly 3 pieces. Simple geometry, really, Blackwood began, his scholarly tone emerging. When you factor in the metallurgical stress points and the angular momentum of... Old Jack's arrival interrupted the impromptu physics lesson. The former lawman's wooden leg thumped against the floorboards as he approached Blackwood's desk. Got word from my contacts. Stories are spreading faster than spring fire. They're calling you the calculator now, the man who brought mathematics to gunfighting. Rather missing the point, aren't they? Blackwood mused, touching the book of Chinese military wisdom in his vest pocket. It was never about the mathematics itself, but about understanding that precision and knowledge can overcome brute force and violence. Through the window, they could see Buck McGraw and his remaining men loading their wagons. The once arrogant gunman had been thoroughly humbled, his reputation shattered along with the guns he'd trusted in. He'd been offered a choice: face trial for conspiracy with Ramirez or leave town and never return. He'd chosen exile. Exile. Speaking of mathematics, Emma Sullivan said, entering with fresh coffee for everyone, you might be interested in some calculations I've been doing. Bar fights down by 80%. Property damage claims almost 0. And business? She smiled. Nearly doubled now that people aren't afraid to come to town. The Scorpion gang's reputation is finished too, Mason added. Word is, no outlaw gang will come within 50 miles of Redemption's Edge. They're calling it Calculator's territory. Now. Blackwood's response was interrupted by Martha Gray arriving with a group of her students. The children carried a large package wrapped in brown paper. The children wanted to thank you, Martha explained, her eyes bright. For protecting them. For showing them that brain can overcome brawn. The package contained a new sign for the sheriff's office. Beneath the official lettering, the children had carefully painted an equation. Justice equals knowledge plus precision. Had some help with the mathematics, Martha admitted with a smile. Though Tommy Chen seems to have inherited your gift for calculations, been helping him study advanced arithmetic after school. More visitors arrived throughout the day, lawmen seeking knowledge, reporters wanting stories, even a professor from back east hoping to study what he called the applied mathematics of peacekeeping. Each one expected to find a cold calculator, a human machine who had reduced gunfighting to pure numbers. Instead, they found a scholarly man who believed that understanding led to precision, and precision allowed for mercy. Tell me something, Thomas, Doc Hayes asked quietly during a lull between visitors. That day with Ramirez's triple-barrel gun, how did you calculate the shots so quickly? The physics involved, the multiple trajectories. Blackwood cleaned his spectacles thoughtfully. In that moment, it wasn't just mathematics. It was understanding that every problem, whether in physics or human conflict, has a solution that doesn't require destruction. The calculations were just tools to find that solution. As evening approached, Redemption's Edge settled into a new kind of peace. The saloon still buzzed with activity, but the talk was different now. Instead of bragging about kills, men discussed trajectory calculations. Rather than challenging each other to duels, they debated the physics of precise shooting. In his jail cell, Vicente Ramirez sat reading one of Blackwood's books on basic mathematics. The notorious outlaw had requested it himself, saying he wanted to understand how he'd been defeated by equations and mercy rather than speed and violence. Never seen anything like it, old Jack commented, watching the sunset paint the street in gold. 50 years wearing a badge. Thought I'd seen every kind of lawman there was. But you've created something new, Thomas. A way of keeping peace that doesn't depend on who's fastest to kill. Blackwood stood at his window, those scholarly hands automatically checking his guns with practiced precision. Not new, Jack. just forgotten. The ancient Chinese scholars wrote about it. The idea that supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Deputy Mason, cleaning his own weapon with newly learned precision, looked up. Think it'll last? This new way of doing things? The mathematics will, Blackwood replied with quiet certainty. Once people understand that precision allows for choice, that calculation creates options beyond simple violence. They can't go back to the old ways. Outside, children played at being lawmen, pointing fingers instead of toy guns, calling out mathematical terms instead of bang-bang. Their parents watched with amused pride, remembering a day when lightning-fast calculations had proven stronger than brutal force. As night fell over Redemption's Edge, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood returned to his desk, wire-rimmed spectacles catching the lamplight as he opened a new book of calculations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new equations to solve, new opportunities to prove that knowledge guided by precision could overcome any obstacle. The legend of the calculator would grow, spreading across territories and generations. But in Redemption's Edge, they remembered something more important, that the deadliest gun in the West had been wielded by hands gentle enough to help deliver babies, precise enough to disarm without death, and wise enough to know that true strength lay not in the ability to take life, but in the calculation and mercy required to preserve it. 1 month after the Great Calculation, Redemption's Edge had become more than just a town. It was a symbol of a new way of thinking about law and justice. The territorial governor himself arrived to see the place where mathematics had defeated mayhem, where precision had overcome pure force. Sheriff Blackwood's office had been transformed into an informal academy. Lawmen from across the territories came to learn not just about shooting, but about the principles behind precision and calculation. The scholarly sheriff's lessons went beyond mere marksmanship. Gentlemen, he addressed a group of eager students, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the morning light. The mathematics of conflict resolution involves more than trajectory calculations. It requires understanding that every situation offers multiple solutions if you know how to solve for the correct variables. Among his students sat 2 familiar faces, Clay Winters and Bear, former members of Buck McGraw's gang. They'd chosen to stay in Redemption's Edge, asking to learn the new way. Even more surprisingly, they showed a genuine aptitude for the mathematical principles behind precise shooting. Never thought I'd be studying geometry, Bear admitted, his massive hands carefully drawing angles in a notebook. Always figured gunfighting was about speed and nerve. But this, he gestured to a complex diagram of trajectories. This makes sense. Deputy Mason, now teaching alongside his mentor, smiled at the transformation. Remember what the sheriff always says. Understanding leads to precision. Precision allows for mercy. Word of the calculator's method spread far beyond the territories. Eastern newspapers ran stories about the scholarly lawman who had revolutionized peacekeeping. Universities debated the implications of applying mathematical principles to law enforcement. Some called it the future of justice. Others dismissed it as an impossible ideal. But the proof was in the results. Towns that adopted Blackwood's methods reported dramatic decreases in violence. Lawmen trained in precision shooting found themselves resolving conflicts without bloodshed. The old way of measuring a sheriff's effectiveness by his kill count was giving way to a new standard. How many lives he could save through precise calculation. Doc Hayes maintained a different kind of record. 6 months without a fatal shooting in town, she reported during one of the regular gatherings in Emma's saloon. Used to be we couldn't go 6 days. And it's not just here. Getting reports from all over about lawmen using calculation instead of killing. Even Vicente Ramirez, serving his time in the territorial prison, had become an unexpected advocate for the new methods. He wrote letters to his former gang members explaining how understanding the mathematics of precision had shown him a different path. The professor didn't just defeat me, he wrote in one widely circulated letter. He showed me that the strongest force isn't the one that destroys, but the one that can choose not to destroy. Old Jack Turner, watching the transformation from his usual spot, shared stories of the early days when he'd first recognized something special in the scholarly Easterner, who combined book learning with guncraft. "Knew it the first time I saw him calculate a shot," he told anyone who'd listen. "Wasn't about being fastest. Was about understanding the geometry of the situation, seeing the solution before anyone else even knew there was a problem." The town itself had evolved. Where once gun shops dominated the main street, now there were bookstores. Martha Gray's school had expanded to include advanced mathematics classes. Even the saloon talk had changed. Men were more likely to debate calculation methods than challenge each other to draws. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people viewed conflict itself. Blackwood's influence had shown that intelligence and precision could overcome brute force, that understanding could defeat violence. "The true power of mathematics," he explained to a reporter from a Chicago newspaper, "isn't in the calculations themselves. It's in teaching us that every problem has a solution, if we're precise enough in our thinking and merciful enough in our actions." Emma Sullivan, ever practical, had started printing pamphlets describing the basic principles of precise shooting. The Calculator's Guide to Peaceful Resolution became popular reading in law enforcement circles. Each copy included Blackwood's fundamental equation: justice equals knowledge plus precision. As summer turned to fall, more stories emerged from across the territories. A sheriff in Arizona who used trajectory calculations to disarm an entire gang without firing a lethal shot. A marshal in New Mexico who applied geometric principles to prevent a bloody range war. Each success proved that the calculator's methods weren't just theory. They were a practical path to a less violent future. "You've started something remarkable," Doc Hayes told Blackwood one evening as they watched the sunset paint the town in gold. "Something that could change the whole frontier." The scholarly sheriff cleaned his spectacles thoughtfully. "Change only happens one calculation at a time," he replied. "Each person who learns there's another way becomes a teacher to others." In his jail cell, one of Ramirez's former lieutenants worked on basic algebra problems under Mason's supervision. In the saloon, Clay Winters demonstrated precise shooting techniques to fascinated newcomers. And in the schoolhouse, young Tommy Chen solved complex trajectory equations, dreaming of a day when he too could prove that knowledge and precision could overcome any obstacle. The legend of the calculator had evolved into something more than just another tall tale of the West. It had become a blueprint for a new kind of justice, where intelligence trumped violence, where precision enabled mercy, and where the fastest gun was the one that didn't need to kill. 6 months after the Great Calculation, a special gathering took place in Redemption's Edge. The territorial governor had made it official. The town would become home to the first Academy of Precise Justice, with Sheriff Thomas Blackwood as its chief instructor. Lawmen from across the country came to witness the inauguration, to see the place where mathematics had revolutionized the meaning of law enforcement. The once dusty Main Street had been transformed. Where Buck McGraw's men had once swaggered with their guns, students now carried books of calculations. The Dusty Spur saloon, under Emma Sullivan's guidance, had become a gathering place for discussion of trajectory physics and ethical law enforcement. "Never thought I'd see the day," Old Jack commented, watching from his usual spot as a group of sheriffs practiced precision shooting under Blackwood's guidance. "When I first taught you about combining book learning with guncraft, people said it was foolishness. Now look at what you've built." Blackwood adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, those quick eyes analyzing his student's form. "We're just beginning to understand the true implications. Every new student brings fresh insights, new applications of the principles." Inside the converted schoolhouse, Deputy Mason taught basic mathematics to a class of eager lawmen. The young deputy had grown into his role, combining practical experience with theoretical knowledge. On the walls hung diagrams showing the geometry of precise shooting, alongside the now famous equation, justice equals knowledge plus precision. Doc Hayes maintained a different kind of record, a growing list of towns that had adopted Blackwood's methods. "Violent deaths down by 80% in places using the calculator's principles," she reported during the evening gathering. "Even hardened outlaws are thinking twice about challenging lawmen trained in precise shooting." The evidence of change was everywhere. Clay Winters, once Buck McGraw's right-hand man, now served as an instructor in basic trajectory calculation. Bear, the former enforcer, had discovered a talent for teaching the mathematical principles behind disarming shots. But perhaps the most profound transformation was visible in the newest arrival to town, Vicente Ramirez himself. Released early for good behavior and his role in promoting peaceful law enforcement from prison, he had come to make amends and learn directly from the man who had defeated him with calculation rather than killing. "Professor," he addressed Blackwood, using the title with respect rather than mockery, "I owe you more than just an apology. You showed me there was another way, a better way." Blackwood's response was characteristic of his teaching style. "The principles were always there, Mr. Ramirez. In mathematics, in physics, in human nature itself. We just had to learn to see them." The celebration continued into evening, but it wasn't the wild revelry typical of Western towns. Instead, groups gathered to discuss applications of geometric principles to peacekeeping, to share stories of conflicts resolved through precision rather than violence, to plan for a future where intelligence guided justice. Emma Sullivan had organized a special display in her saloon. The preserved pieces of the 47 guns disabled during the Great Calculation, arranged to show the precise points where Blackwood's bullets had struck. Alongside them hung a new sign, "Precision preserves life." As night fell, Blackwood stood on his office porch, those scholarly hands automatically checking his guns with practiced care. Doc Hayes joined him, bringing coffee strong enough to fuel advanced calculations. "Thinking about that morning?" she asked. "When they all thought a bookworm sheriff would be easy prey?" "Thinking about assumptions," he replied, cleaning his spectacles. "How people assume that force must be met with force, that violence is the only answer to violence. But mathematics teaches us that every problem has multiple solutions, if we're precise enough to find them." Young Tommy Chen hurried up, carrying a new book of calculations. The boy who had once been threatened by outlaws was now the Academy's youngest student, showing a natural gift for the mathematics of precise justice. "Sheriff," he called out excitedly, "I think I've solved that problem about compensating for crosswinds and disarming shots. Want to see my equations?" Blackwood's smile carried the warmth of a teacher seeing his principles carried forward. The future of law enforcement wasn't in faster draws or deadlier aim, but in young minds, understanding that precision guided by knowledge could overcome any challenge. As the stars emerged over redemption's edge, the legend of the calculator had evolved into something more lasting than mere story. It had become a blueprint for a new kind of justice, where intelligence replaced brutality, where accuracy enabled mercy, and where the deadliest gun was the one that could choose not to kill. The calloused hands at the Dusty Spur no longer laughed at their scholarly sheriff. Instead, they learned from him, understanding finally that true strength lay not in the ability to take life, but in the precision and wisdom required to preserve it. In Redemption's Edge, the equation of justice had been solved not with blood and thunder, but with calculation, accuracy, and the steady hand of a lawman who brought mathematics to the art of peacekeeping. And if you're watching this story thinking that strength comes only from force, remember the lesson of the calculator. Sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the fastest gun, but the sharpest mind combined with the most precise hands. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more amazing true stories from the American frontier, where history proves that reality can be more fascinating than fiction. Don't forget to hit that notification bell to never miss an update. We'll see you in the next video. See you.